If you want to pump your body and expand your mind, there's only one place to go. Mind Pump. Mind Pump with your hosts, Sal DiStefano, Adam Schaefer, and Justin Andrews.
So this is going to be a fun one for a lot of the audience that loves bodybuilding talk, your technical bodybuilding talk. I love this conversation. I'd had a lot of people that had reached out and told me that we had to get connected to Dr. Scott Stevenson. And we had a few mutual friends reached out. He flew out to the studio and hung out and just had a great conversation with us.
Yeah, it was very technical. It's like most of the conversation is about muscle building, hypertrophy. I think we talked about anabolics a little bit in this episode. So if you're really interested in the intricacies of building muscle and you like muscle talk, you're going to love this episode. Now, Dr. Scott Stevenson, super smart guy, one of the smarter guys in our space. His website is BYOBBcoach.com, so BYOBBcoach.com. He has his own podcast called Muscle Minds, and the website for that is advicesradio.com. And then he wrote a book called Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach. And then finally, you can find him on Instagram at fortitude_training. So we think you're going to enjoy this episode. Before it starts, I do want to remind everybody that Maps Anywhere is 50% off. Now remember, Maps Anywhere is the workout program designed to maximize your body's ability to build muscle, burn body fat, and improve its mobility without any gym equipment. So this workout, the entire workout, can be done outdoors. It could be done at home. It could be done on the road in a hotel room. It's extremely effective, but it's very convenient, again, because you don't need any equipment. Now, it's 50% off all month long. So if you go to mapswhite.com, that's MAPSWHITE.com, and use the code ANYWHERE50, ANYWHERE50, no space, you'll get the 50% off discount for Maps Anywhere. So that's it. Without any further ado, here we are interviewing Dr. Scott Stevenson. What I found fascinating about you is your blend of Eastern and Western influences.
Yes.
With your, because you've got the Western education, PhD. What's your PhD in? Exercise physiology?
Exercise physiology, yeah.
And then you're also an acupuncturist with the Chinese, understanding what Chinese medicine and herbs and whatnot.
Yeah, I'm a Chinese herbalist, nationally certified Chinese herbalist. I'm actually licensed in the state of Arizona as an acupuncturist. So you can call yourself an acupuncture physician there. It's the legal title, but my license is inactive. There's no point in, I'm so busy with the bodybuilding things that there's no point in trying to squeeze that in because the overhead of trying to run a full practice.
How do both of those impact what you do for bodybuilding? Like, what are some things you've taken from both that have really contributed to your ability to put muscle on people?
Oh, geez. I'm very, very open to herbs just in general. I have to be careful. Like legally, you can't do telemedicine as an acupuncturist or an herbalist because you need to see them in person. The nature of the diagnostic techniques, because this was something that developed thousands of years ago, required that you see the person. Like some people are really good at facial diagnosis, for instance. They can read the face and basically read your mind in the same way. And so I can't do too much long distance, but I've figured out ways in which when someone gets sick, for instance, what kind of herbs they're readily available. I'll load people up. I've been doing this for literally decades, load people up on echinacea and various herbs that have antimicrobial actions. I just sent someone an herb called Banlan Gen, which is has a wide spectrum antimicrobial action, which is just a very common tea that people would drink in China. It's kind of basic stuff, but we don't know about it here. What
do you see in the face, like, do you tongue? Do you look at the tongue also? And
tongue and pulse are the mainstays. There are various schools of thought that have developed over the course of centuries, sort of at different time periods in the history of Chinese medicine. What we get in the U.S. Is kind of a generic combination, general practitioner type of Chinese medicine training. If someone were to be functioning as a Chinese medical practitioner in China, most of the time they're an internal medicine person, which means they're an herbalist. That's their focus. They know that back and forth. And you might go into a complementary medicine situation where they've got Western medicine. So the regular MDs in China, and then they'll have an acupuncturist who just does acupuncture. So it's a Chinese acupuncturist, and then herbalist who just does herbs. They might also funnel someone to do some internal martial arts like Qigong or Tai Chi as well, if that's what they see as needed. So there'll be different specialists. In the U.S., you get trained, they just basically roll it all together. So it's about a 3,000 hour long program with clinical and didactic training. It's a 4-year program, but they squeeze it down into 3 because you go continuously.
What actually even interested you in going and getting into Eastern medicine after you already have your PhD over here? What drove you that direction?
That's a great question. So I was an assistant. I was at Cal Poly Pomona, down the road from you guys here.
Love that college.
Yeah. So I was an assistant professor there, and I was trying to figure out. I had the opportunity to do research and try to toss my pennies in the giant pool of the research literature, and I love doing research, but I realized, where can I do the most good for people? Where can I basically have the greatest impact on the world? And I wanted to be able to reach out as much as possible, interact with people. I've been a personal trainer and a coach for years. And I wanted to be able to do just nutritional interventions. So if someone were to come in, let's say, and do some research work, do some sort of a community outreach type of thing in the lab there at the school, you just have them exercise. You don't address their nutrition. You're pissing in the wind, pardon my French. So I was thinking about becoming a registered dietitian, and then I started looking into other ways legally that I could actually do nutritional interventions. And in California, acupuncture is gigantic, same as it is in Florida. So I looked into acupuncture, and I started looking around for different schools. And actually, I took a sabbatical. I had a leave of absence from Cal Poly Pomona to go and start my training in acupuncture. I took some classes there in California at South Baylor University, and then I went to Tucson and started training there. And then I sort of decided, this is where my path needs to lead me, is stepping out of academia. I still dabbled a little bit as an adjunct, for instance, at University of Tampa. It's hard to get back in. Once you sort of leave and burn that bridge, like going back into like a tenure track position is almost impossible. That's just kind of how it works. But it was fine. So that's what brought me there, because Chinese medicine is a full system of medicine. Yeah. You like I said, in Florida, you're an acupuncture physician. You can be a general practitioner here in California. It's a holistic form of medicine. So it was better than just becoming a registered dietitian. Right. And you can couch. I mean, you have to be careful where and how you do this legally speaking, but I can count if I wanted to. If I saw someone in person back in Florida, and my license were active, I could see them and couch my dietary recommendations for them as a bodybuilder, let's say dieting down or what have you, in the context of Chinese medicine. In just the same way that a physician could legally tell anybody anything, although Western allopathic physicians don't necessarily know medicine or nutrition all that well. And dietitians can do that, chiropractors can do that, naturopaths can do that, osteopaths can do that, and acupuncturists can do that. But it's more than that. You're a massage therapist. I'm a body worker too. Yeah. And you've got the herbs, which is a whole system of medicine, and the acupuncture, which is phenomenal for pain. And the thing that's really kind of cool about a lot of acupuncture, this can be pushed too far. You guys are probably familiar with what can happen with some chiropractors. Some chiropractors are phenomenal, and then some chiropractors are kind of wackadoodle. They can go like way off the beaten path and start doing all sorts of bizarre things. Chinese medicine practitioners, acupuncturists, will do the same thing too. So they can focus on, let's say, allergy elimination. There's a woman actually down in California who came up with an allergy elimination technique that works phenomenally well. And I have a bizarre story. I actually saw that happen once. It's a totally woo-woo type of thing. So one of the things that I learned a long while ago is when I was in my master's degree in Texas, I took a class from a woman named Juanine Sperduso, who's just brilliant. She was she was a woman in academia. She was probably in her 60s at the time. That was very rare. To become a tenure professor in academia as a woman when she went through means she's just tough as nails. And so you would think she's going to be just straight-laced, show me the evidence, give me the proof, show me the data. Otherwise, it's totally bunk. And she taught this research methods class. And one of the big sections, and this is actually in my book, lying there on the coffee table in front of us, is there are various ways of knowing things. And you can know it through your intuition. You can know it because you read the research. I mean, sometimes the research can be fabricated too. You can know it because you've seen it in the trenches in the gym. You can know it because your mom told you. You can know it because you had a dream, and you can weigh those things in different ways. So when I went into Chinese medicine, it was really funny. I was an assistant professor in a tenure track program there at Cal Poly Pomona, and I'm taking these Chinese medicine classes, and I'm continuously having to suspend my disbelief. Because I'm like, where's the evidence for this? Show me, show me, show me, show me, show me. And the evidence is in thousands of years of practitioners figuring this stuff out. Yeah. And the whole paradigm, the way I sort of couch it with people is that the paradigm of Chinese medicine is sort of like Newtonian physics, the laws of Newtonian physics, where you can, if you want to know how far a projectile is going to go, or you just plug in the velocity and the mass and those sorts of things, you can figure out where a rocket's going to go. You can launch a man into space using Newtonian physics. Those laws apply. But physicists will say, well, quantum mechanics gives us a deeper, more true understanding of what's really going on. Newtonian physics really doesn't give us the penultimate explanatory view of the world from a physics standpoint. Well, Chinese medicine is just a paradigm. Like the idea of qi and yin and yang and blood is a vital substance, all these sorts of things. It's not that you can necessarily measure those in some way, shape, or form per se.
But it also doesn't discredit them either, right?
It just means that the paradigm is a way of looking at things. Exactly. It doesn't discredit them. So as long as you stick with the paradigm and apply it and use it, it has usefulness in the real world, just like Newtonian physics does.
Now, do you remember the first, paradigm shattering moment that you had being a guy that came from Western medicine and now all of a sudden you're learning all this Eastern medicine? Was there the first oh shit, maybe everything that I was taught before wasn't all?
There's various moments. There was once I had actually, what sort of brought me in that direction in part was I was living in LA. The pollution's horrible. I was coughing and hacking. I wasn't doing well with the pollution. So I went and saw an acupuncturist, and that wasn't so helpful, but it clued me into the idea of Chinese medicine. I read up about it. I looked at the NIH position stand, those sorts of things. And one day I was really, really sick. I think I'd eaten something. I was super, super nauseated. And literally, and I have an iron gut. I've only thrown up from training maybe 3 or 4 times over the course of the years, and I've done some pretty horrendous training. And literally, I drove down to get an acupuncture treatment, just sort of as an exploratory type of thing, at the South Baylo University in there in LA. And I felt awful. I got out of my car and I went over and threw up in the bushes. And I walked in and I sat down. It was just a student there. And he's like, how are you feeling? I feel awful. I feel absolutely terrible. He's like, what's wrong? He's like, I'm nauseated. He's like, well, let's fix that for you. He laid down and he put needles in what's called pericardium 6. It's the point here where they put those seasickness bands.
Right.
Yeah. And so I'm lying there, just feeling horrible. And about 5 seconds later, he says, how you feeling now? I'm like, all right, that was magic. What the hell did you just do? It went away instantaneously.
Wow.
I'm like, oh, so how where's the
nerve?
This to me. Explain this one. Like, what the hell's going on here? So that's just an empirical point. It's been found empirically for nausea. As far as I know, no one has traced some sort of nervous pathway, that leads down to the gut, to the enteric nervous system, or up to the brain, the areas that would be activated when someone has nausea. But there's something there, and I've seen that multiple times. That's why people use that as a seasickness treatment. Literally, you can buy those bands, and it does help many, many people.
And they work.
They do.
What you said that I really like is how you compare Newtonian physics to quantum physics, and there is no unified theory with physics. They try to get them to work together, but they don't. It doesn't make sense because at the very small, things operate differently in the very large. And when it comes to health, I think that's a great comparison because there are. I mean, Chinese medicine has existed for thousands of years and does have that kind of evidence supporting it. My question to you is, what have you taken from Chinese medicine and applied? Because Chinese medicine is very much about balance, very much about balancing energy systems in the body. If you have too much yang energy, they'll try and balance it with some yin. Bodybuilding is a very yang sport. It's very testosterone. It's very aggressive, lots of stimulants. And that probably causes people a lot of problems without balancing. Were you able to take some of your knowledge from Chinese medicine and help even the extreme bodybuilders?
I'm looking at health almost continuously with everyone. I've got that was a perspective as an acupuncturist, is you're trying to make someone as healthy as possible. Whereas you're right, competitive bodybuilding is not about health.
No.
It's about basically trying to hack whatever adaptations you can from your body in the most extreme way possible. Come hell or high water. And sometimes it is hell and high water for people that push. So interestingly enough, there's next week sometime we're going to record on my podcast with a former client of mine who came to me, and he wanted to get his pro card, a very typical type of thing. And I always ask goals. That's the first section of my book is, what are your goals? Like big time bodybuilding goals, life goals, everything. Where does it all fit? Where does this bodybuilding thing balance with the rest of what you want to do with your life? And he had just gotten engaged or married at that time, and he wanted to have kids. And I said, okay. And he lives in the UK, so steroid use is totally legal. It's not really frowned upon socially in the way it is in the States. And that was going to be a no-go. So we had to, and we'll probably go into this on the podcast, but I had to go in and kind of do a detailed medical history with him as best as possible to figure out, so is it going to matter like 5 years from now? I sometimes use the rules of 5, like will it matter in 5 minutes, will it matter in 5 weeks, 5 months, 5 years, 5 decades? How do we rank things in terms of importance? And 5 years from now, whether you got a pro card may or may not matter, but 5 years from now or 15 or 20 years from now, whether he has a child and he has a family with the woman that he loves is going to matter a whole heck of a lot more. So that's what we did. We spent basically a year doing a PCT type of thing. We used the program for wellness restoration, Power PCT.
Okay, and PCT is post-cycle therapy.
Post-cycle therapy, yeah. Michael Scally came up with that one.
Pharmaceuticals, or did you use herbs and medicine, Chinese medicine, or both?
I chose the best way I knew, and there's a little bit of research showing this in like HIV patients that have used steroids for increasing red blood cell count and holding on to muscle mass, that you can restore endogenous testosterone with this protocol using HCG and aromatase inhibitor and Clomid. And so we had to run him through that a few times, and he went from like basically a nil sperm count to having a baby girl.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. So like those are the types of things that I will lose clients very often because if they're so single-mindedly focused in a way that at least they won't tell me what their concerns are about their long-term health, they might just back away. I've had clients before, I'll ask questions because, for instance, the GI health, it's central to Chinese medicine. I think it's central to bodybuilding too. We talked about Jordan Peterson before and how much food he could put down. 10,000
calories a day, you said at that one point.
He made it up to 10 grand a day, yeah, when he was really, really putting it on. And getting that food in was essential for the growth that he that he got during that period of time when we were working together. So I'll ask people, Chinese medicine, you ask a dozen questions about their poop, do they have regurg? Do they have bloating? It tells you about all the organs, quote unquote, the energetic organs in Chinese medicine. Literally, there's in a lot of books, the basic Chinese medical books, there'll be a whole chapter just on the poop. Is it long and thin? Is it round? Is it diarrhea? Does it have blood in it? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll ask questions about bowel movement and poop, and I've had clients, it's like, why are you asking me this? I'm like, this is important. Like if you got blood and mucus in your stool on a regular basis, we've got bigger issues than whether or not you're going to get first or third in your next bodybuilding show. At least the way I look at it. So it may be somewhat, I guess you could say in a way, arrogant for me to think that I would know what's best for someone, but I'm just trying to do the best I possibly can to help as many people as possible. So I always step back from that medical practitioner standpoint and try to help in that way.
Excellent. Now, someone like yourself with your kind of education and intelligence, are you ever, and you coming from the bodybuilding space, which is also for decades has been very bro science-y. Lots of hearsay. This is what we do. Why? Because that's just the way we do it. Are you ever shocked at how sometimes the old wisdom turns out to be true, where you prove it with science? You ever shocked by any of
that? Not so much, to be honest. The thing here's the discussion that I have so often, and I really find it fascinating because I ride the fence like that, is that almost all of the bro sciencey things that have proven themselves to be true over the years. If you dig and dig and dig and dig and dig, which is something I love to do, you can find at least some semblance of an explanation in the Western science. You're not going to get it just by reading titles of papers or just skimming through abstracts. But if you dig deep in, you can figure out why these things might or might not work. One thing we're going to talk about maybe is training, and I've got this would launch us into probably about a 10-minute explanation if you guys want to go there.
Oh, love it.
Okay,
Yeah.
So the bro split.
Yeah.
Where guys will train like once a week. And that's, if you look at the biggest bodybuilders, the biggest pros, most of them train that way. So stepping back, there has been research done looking at extreme responders, people who just basically grow by driving past the gym. They just grow no matter what. And the moderate responders. And there are people with non-responders when it comes to muscle growth. Same thing.
Most people.
Yeah, a lot of people, relatively speaking. There's some that are literally non-responders.
Sure, the hard gainers.
They'll get nothing.
Right.
They'll train for 8 or 12 weeks, and you see, I love these studies. I have a talk that I've actually given with John Meadows, who I know you had on.
Yeah.
He was instrumental in getting me over here today. Why you don't look like a pro. And I go through biological interindividuality in various ways. And there are studies where they have the individual subject plots of muscle growth, like increasing cross-sectional area with an MRI. And there are people that are they're like below the zero line. Like that's just, some of that's just measurement error, but they literally got nothing. They trained their butts off in a lab setting, got yelled at by these guys, come on, push, and they get no growth.
Yeah.
And then there's some people who just grow like weeds. And one of the things, there's several things that sort of fit in there, but one of the things that's really important for muscle growth, and it's the way it normally would occur, is an increase in satellite cells, which you guys have probably talked about here several times. So you need to have more satellite cells in the muscle cell. They each have what's called a myonuclear domain in order to sort of govern the protein synthesis and all the ultrastructural maintenance that goes on.
Now, if you don't mind explaining what a satellite cell is in the muscle, it's like a stem cell, right? Or
it's like a muscle-specific stem cell.
Okay.
So it's not a contractile cell. It's not expressing contractile proteins. It's not adding to force. It's not connected to the connective tissue, the epimysium or paramysium that winds through the muscle. So it's doing nothing but kind of hanging out and gathering information. There's some really cool stuff on what satellite cells can do.
Oh, very cool.
There was one study where they took the satellite cells out of endurance athletes and cultured those in a petri dish and looked at insulin sensitivity in these satellite cells that had never undergone any of the endurance activity of those endurance trained individuals. It could have been some genetic things that are going on here. These people that have endurance trained have genetic advantages. That's why they're doing endurance training. But when they cultured those satellite cells that had never done any activity, they had greater insulin sensitivity than satellite cells from sedentary people. That's exactly what you see in skeletal muscle that had been active. But these satellite cells never had been. That's probably an epigenetic phenomenon.
Wow.
Yeah, so they're picking up on the environment. So when muscles are damaged or when they're growing, the satellite cells will proliferate. They'll make a copy of themselves. And kind of the standard way you'd look at it is they might make a copy. So there's two of them, and one of those will make its way into the muscle cell and set up shop on the periphery of the muscle cell so you can have all the protein synthesis and take care of all the interaction with mitochondrial proteins, et cetera. I always liken it to if you're building a larger city, you need more post offices. So as the city enlarges, you're going to be able to transport all the proteins around and basically keep organizational structure in the larger city. You need more post offices. And those things stick around. That's one of the mechanisms of muscle memory. So
like, in other words, build a bunch of muscle, you get more satellite cells, muscle shrinks, satellite cells stick around.
They do.
And that's probably why muscles grow back twice as fast the second time around.
That's one of the mechanisms.
That's the theories, right?
Yeah. Epigenetics is the other one, where some of those genes become probably demethylated or otherwise set up so they more easily express themselves under the stimulus of training. So individuals who are the extreme responders, when they start out, they tend to have more satellite cells. They have a higher satellite cell density. And they also get a greater release of mechanogrowth factor. It's an IGF-1 splice variant, kind of IGF-1 that triggers all that satellite cell activity. So they start off with more satellite cells, and their satellite cells are get a better oomph to do their job to set up shop so the muscle cells can get bigger. And the people who are non-responders, they don't have those advantages. And as best I can find, I'm waiting for someone to explore this, but as best I can find, that satellite cell activity that's triggered by the mechanogrowth factor, myogenin is another protein that's expressed in those satellite cells when they're doing their business. It lasts maybe 5 or 6 days, just about a week. Mm-hmm. So if you're someone who's a responder, who gets a good release of mechanogrowth factor to turn all that satellite cell activity, that activity is happening for about close to a week. So you're getting you train once, and then you've got all those things set in motion for about a week. You come back and train again. Now, if you're someone who's got a piddly response as far as turning on those satellite cells, then maybe you get a little bit of mechanogrowth factor, maybe you get a little bit of response, but not quite enough to really turn on the satellite cell activity as much as you'd like to. Someone like that might need to provide another stimulus.
More frequent training. Yeah. And what I found as a personal trainer, who I trained average people. I didn't train very many bodybuilders. It was just everyday people. Most people responded really well to training their whole body a few days a week. And then the few people that I did work with who were hyper responders, once a week. And then, now, what about muscle protein synthesis and how they measure that? And they find that it spikes and kind of drops after about 48, 72 hours. That's a different mechanism that we're measuring?
Yeah, that's part of it. That's part of what's going on. What's interesting is that is turned on. It's actually blunted the more trained you get, and it's shortened as well from the data that we have. So that suggests if you're just looking at those numbers, you could train every other day, possibly. It's a standard, basically example of a training adaptation. When you initially train and the stimulus is new and fresh, you will get this major response. And then the next time you train, or the more trained you become, the less of a perturbation in the equilibrium of the cell that becomes. So the protein synthesis isn't turned on as much. The muscle protein breakdown isn't turned on as much. You don't get as sore, all those sorts of things. So you have to push harder in order to elicit further adaptations. And the muscle protein synthesis is obviously very important for that.
Now, I have a question for you. So, because that suggests that, the variables, adjusting variables in your training will help maintain that protein synthesis signal, right? Not doing the same thing over and over.
Right.
But at the same time, I've seen people take that so far to where they change their workout so often that they don't get enough. They don't get enough of that skill and that strength of focusing on certain, like for example, a barbell squat. It might take you months to get good enough at it to be able to really maximize the benefit of it. Whereas, we're hearing that you need to switch things up all the time. Where's that happy medium, or how do you judge that?
Yeah. So there's two different competing. I did a talk with John this year at the Arnold Classic, and I kind of covered this one. There's so many different lines of research that suggest both of those things. Daily undulating periodization is the idea that you'd use like a low rep range, a moderate rep range, and a higher rep range on different days of the week. So all of those different rep ranges are all good stimuli for muscle growth. They're all going to turn on hypertrophy. So you want to use all of them in a way so that you don't get refractory to the same stimulus over and over and over again of always training heavy. But the bottom line is, at least when it comes to strength, as best of I believe, and this is one of those things that's in the research. This is why I did this talk. Is there are several studies where they've looked at the increase in strength and the increase in muscle size, fiber size, or lean body mass, and those things correlate really, really well. Probably the best study that I know of was done with rugby players. And funny you mentioned squats, because they followed them for 2 years. And the correlation and increase in squat 1 rep max, and it's not that you necessarily have to do a 1 rep max. Just doing 1 rep max is probably not the best way to trigger muscle growth. Powerlifters aren't necessarily always the biggest guys. The bodybuilders are.
Right.
But that increase in 1 rep max in the squat correlated, I think the correlation was like 0.88.
Wow.
Over 2 years with increase in lean body mass.
Yeah, direct.
That covers about 80% of the variance in lean body mass. So you can imagine that. Imagine someone who took their squat from 300 to 450, and someone who took their squat from 260 to 285.
Yeah, you're going to see more growth than the guy that did the.
Yeah, it's pretty simple, and that's kind of common sense. It's bro science. The biggest guys are generally the strongest guys. It's not a perfect 1-to-1, but if you double your strength on all your main core lifts, that's gonna show up in some way, shape, or form. Some of that's neurological. Hopefully, as much of it as possible is muscular. So the part of that, which I think you were kind of hinting at, is that you can't just get really, really strong at lifts by just practicing those. That's what powerlifters and Olympic lifters are trying to do. So that's not what you're necessarily wanting to do, is just elicit all those neural adaptations. You want to get stronger perhaps on as many lifts as you possibly can and in many rep ranges as you possibly can. What I would love, I'm surprised, I want to contact these researchers and see if they have to have these data, but I haven't seen them published, is we also know that the low load training, like 30% of a 1 rep max, 30 rep sets, which are brutal, absolutely atrociously brutal.
Yeah, if they're taken to failure, don't they stimulate growth like almost anything else?
On the short term, yeah, you get the same increase in muscle size. Brad Schoenfeld's done one of those. Warren Baum's done one of those studies. Stu Phillips has done one of those studies. I would love to see the correlation between increase in weight used for those low load training.
Oh, I see. So stronger in the 30 rep range.
Yes, because we know stronger in 1 rep max predicts muscle growth. But I haven't. So that would answer the question, which I'm fairly certain is going to be answered with a yes, is that increasing adapting to the training stimulus that turns on muscle hypertrophy is going to mean a hypertrophic adaptation. So whether it's lower reps, higher weight, or higher reps, lower weight, the more you adapt, the more you push yourself, the more you see the logbook and things move forward in the gym, the more muscle growth you're going to get.
In my experience, the training that you're not doing is the one that typically will give you the best.
Yes.
Like if you always train that 1 rep max range,
absolutely,
and then you go to the 30 rep, you just see crazy progress.
Yeah.
And I'll flip. One of my favorite things to do, especially with female clients, because they never train in the heavy rep range, at least not the average female client,
right, is
I'd take them through a strength cycle and blow their mind.
Yeah.
All of a sudden their butt would lift and their hamstrings would develop, and
right,
they'd get great arms and all that stuff. Along these lines, that neural adaptation that we talk about with strength that plays such a big role in maximal strength. So it's not necessarily that your muscles got bigger; it's that the juice going to the muscles, that amp signal is stronger, and you have a more coordinated, I guess, lift. How big of a role does that also play in muscle building? Because if you have a better connection and signal, shouldn't that activate more muscle fibers, or doesn't that also contribute to more muscle growth as well?
So the way I see things, bodybuilding is an attempt to hack the biology of your muscular system in particular in order to create a muscular callus. You really don't care how much stronger you get. In fact, it's better for your overall joint health
probably
to not be lifting as much heavy stuff as you possibly can.
Yeah.
I mean, guys who've done heavy squats for years,
Ronnie Coleman, a good example.
It's like Ronnie Coleman versus Dexter Jackson.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there are so many things that go into those nervous system adaptations. The nervous system is uniquely set up to be able to activate the muscle as it adapts to a stimulus like weight training in a way that can just happen with simple neural reorganization, simple neurological strategy. So there are things like simply being able to activate more motor units than you could before.
Right.
That's a hard thing to test. That research literature is kind of wonky. It's kind of funny, to be honest. But in the brain, for instance, when you're doing a concentric versus an eccentric contraction, there are different areas of the motor cortex that are activated, even for the same muscle group. And it's a weird thing. Literally, I always say it's an unnatural act to lift weights, because you're picking something up and you're putting it right back down.
And doing it again.
You're picking it up and putting it down. What is wrong with you? Move it somewhere, do something with it. Why do you just keep on obsessively picking up and put it down? Well, you're trying to create a callus. It's like rubbing sandpaper on your hand. You're trying to make a callus there. It's like if you saw people doing that. Imagine gyms, in some bizarre alternative universe where people are just trying to make their skin really calloused, and they just go in and they just rub sandpaper all over their bodies. That's kind of what we're doing with weight training. We're trying to make our muscles bigger. There's obviously evolutionary biological reasons for that. It's a display of fitness. So there's things like there's a phenomenon called muscle wisdom, whereby the muscular system will adjust the firing rate of those motor neurons that go to motor units as they fatigue, because fatigued muscle fibers are slower. So you could go on and on. There's all sorts of neurological adaptation. Yes,
they did I can't remember the name of the show, but they were testing high-level athletes, and they had Randy Couture on there, and the test was they had to get a headlock on this device that measured the pressure, and then they had all these sensors all over their body to see how their body was reacting. And they had him compared to other strong athletes, but of course he's a grappler.
Right.
And they're measuring how his muscles are taking turns firing, but because he's been doing this for so long, his body had become so efficient, he was able to apply the same pressure for longer than everybody, not because he was stronger, but because of the efficiency of how his body, that muscle wisdom, in effect, what you're talking about, how the body was able to fire certain muscles and activate some harder than others, but maintain the same level of pressure.
Yeah, within a given muscle, there's a rotation among motor units. So they'll do these studies where they can isolate.
Within the same muscle?
Within the same muscle.
Oh,
a lot of them are like in the hand. It's hard to study these in larger muscles, but they'll be able to isolate different motor units. So one nerve that goes to a number of fibers. And just when someone's turning on, like they're doing some sort of isometric hold, they'll see those motor units come on and come off. So like when I teach this, and I teach it to my classes, or when I'm doing a presentation, I'd say, so this half of the room, you're going to be involved initially when we start with this effort, because it's light, there's no fatigue going on. And the 5 of you on this side of the room, maybe 3 of you are what's needed initially, and then one of you will drop off, the other one will take up the slack for them. And the other person will then drop off, and someone else will take up the slack for them. So you'll kind of rotate the load amongst yourselves. And as the fatigue occurs, then we'll start to call upon those higher threshold motor units. And the nervous system just knows this. The spinal cord figures out what fatigue is going on and how to do this. And it'll start rotating amongst those motor units. So instead of using just 5 of the low threshold, it'll start calling upon 7, 8, and finally maybe all 10. But some of them will be dropping in and some will be dropping out. It's rotating the load to reduce the fatigue. If you just, like electrical stimulation does, if you just turn on the motor units at a given firing rate, the fatigue is great. It's a great way to stimulate muscle growth because it's kind of a bizarre activation pattern. But the nervous system knows how to do that. So it'll rotate amongst, and then when they start to fatigue, it'll adjust the firing rate down as well. Because there's no point in centering firing rate to muscle that's now fatigued and slower. All that does is waste energy in the neurons, and then you have a potential for neural fatigue. So that's the wisdom phenomenon. And then there's what you were sort of getting, I think, with the Randy Couture study, is that different muscles will be getting involved.
Right.
I had a guy a long time ago. He was an older gentleman who had owned a construction company. He was a general contractor, and he was training with his son. He had retired. He wanted to just kind of do something, keep himself active. And we were doing, back and bicep training one day, and I wanted to do a concentration curl with him. And no one could see this, of course, on the radio, but I had him, with his elbow braced against his inner knee, and I just want pure elbow flexion, nothing at all. Just that, just robotic, pure elbow flexion. We're just trying to elbow flexors. He could not help himself but pull his shoulder into it. He was basically using his shoulder to leverage kind of an isometric contraction so he could move the weight up. And I couldn't even hold his shoulder in place. And he had learned that because he'd been picking up heavy stuff for 50 years of his life.
That's
hardwired it.
That's his recruitment pattern.
Yeah, where you talk about that all the time, which it totally reminds me of that. Why that's so important to establish the proper biomechanics and really just hone in on those main sort of movement patterns, so that way you that's what your go-to is when you get that fatigue setting in, right?
Well, that's what you want as a power lifter or an Olympic lifter. You want to use as much muscle as you possibly can, engage as much muscle mass to perform the task. Bodybuilding is just the opposite of that. You want to have the quote-unquote mind-muscle connection, where if he's trying to train his biceps like that, that's no longer a concentration curl. That's just sort of like some sort of an
He's just moving the weight.
He's just moving the weight around.
Right.
And he's basically removing the load as much as possible, because that's how he had been wired to do things from the biceps. So
and this is why I think, because you get good at whatever you train, right? So if you train like a bodybuilder, you start to become good at that. You get very good at isolating and activating and maximizing, muscle growth through these types of patterns. If you're a strength athlete, you maximize patterns to lift maximum weight. This is why I think many times bodybuilding, just pure bodybuilding, has gotten a bad rap in sports, because it trains your body to work in a way that's beneficial for growth, but not necessarily beneficial for total function or performance.
Yeah, that harkens back to specificity of training.
Yes.
So you want to increase the muscle mass in the gym, but make sure you're training the nervous system to use that muscle mass on the field or on the court or wherever it is you can apply it as an athlete.
Exactly. So I have a question for you. Here's a little bro myth that I've witnessed, I've felt, I have no explanation for. I have my theories, but I want to see if you know any science to support this. Okay. For a long time now, and the first time I ever heard about this was Arnold Schwarzenegger's Encyclopedia of Bodybuilding. how they would do a heavy cycle of strength training, and it would produce denser, harder, more granite-looking muscle than the traditional bodybuilding type training. Now, I've seen that in myself. When I train heavy, my muscles seem to feel hard. It's a different feel to my body, and I've noticed this in people I've trained. Is that total bro science, or do you think there's something to explain it? Have you witnessed it yourself?
So that's where people would, if they want to get really bro sciencey, and I just saw someone make mention of this in an article that I need to read, but I addressed this, maybe in this book I addressed it, and I have a fortitude training system, and I addressed it in that book as well. People will then sort of invoke the idea of sarcoplasmic versus myofibrillar hypertrophy.
Sure.
And that is not something you can put those things into Google Scholar, go to PubMed. You don't find that those two types of muscle size increases differentiated in any way, shape, or form. But what we do know is that a certain percentage of the muscle cell is composed of mitochondria, and that can change. It's not a lot. It's maybe 5%, but it might be 3% in type 2 muscle fibers and 5% in others. And then glycogen levels can matter a good bit. And glycogen carries water with it.
Sure.
So that potentially could create this sort of differential look that you're talking about, where you've got a muscle cell that has a little more glycogen in it, and it brings water with it. People will talk about the number of like 2.7 grams of water, gram of glycogen. That's actually from a study with rats in the liver. Yeah. It's glycogen levels in the liver of rats.
You can't really translate that.
No. There was a guy named Mike Sherman at Ohio State who looked into this, and it's all over the place in terms of how much water you get with a given amount of glycogen. The glycogen is stored as a glycogenin complex with protein. There's an osmotic effect, but it seems to vary. How much potassium is in your system can make a difference there. You actually won't glycogen load if you're devoid of potassium, if you're potassium deficient. Potassium is one of the main intracellular electrolytes. So there's that, and there's also intramuscular triglycerides stored in the cells. So you take someone who's doing like a high volume bro type of split, and you're reducing glycogen levels, and actually you use muscle triglyceride pretty substantially. Some Scandinavian researchers have looked into that. It actually can be dropped a good bit, and that varies. That's all over the place from the data I've seen as to how much fat is inside the cells, the skeletal muscle cells. So in doing that, when you have a stimulus that reduces the intracellular fuel stores, the adaptation is to store more of those.
Right.
So you're ready for the next 30 or 40 set workout that you're going to do. So
you get more of that pump, more of that fluid, whatever.
Yeah, well, you get more of the fuel stored in there and the water.
Yeah,
so,
the non-muscle fiber structures and all that.
Exactly, the stuff's in the quote unquote sarcoplasm.
Right.
So there's a little bit of data that sort of would suggest there's some variability there, but I haven't seen anyone. I would love to see someone study that. You can look at.
So would I. It's so subjective though. How would they test that? Like
myofibrillar packing density.
Okay.
Is what they would do.
Okay.
So they look at do a cross section of the muscle. You can look at the myofibrils and see how densely they're packed in the skull. So if you have two cells that are exactly the same size, and one has 90 myofibrils, these numbers aren't at all accurate, and the other one has 100, the one with 90 has a lower myofibrillar packing density. So it's going to have more sarcoplasmic volume relative to the myofibrillar volume.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Now, what about muscle hyperplasia? When I first got my certification years ago, 20-something years ago, it didn't happen. They said, it doesn't happen in humans. We've only seen it in animals. Now some studies are showing that, no, it might happen in humans. It might take a long time to happen. Hyperplasia is where basically you get more muscle fibers. Not just that your muscle fibers grow, but that you actually add more muscle fibers to your muscle. What does the current research say about that?
It's I would say it's highly likely in well-trained bodybuilders, and there's actually the strongest piece of evidence to that effect comes from data that's now decades old, where they've looked at the fibers of guys who are doing the bro split, high volume type of thing, and they have large muscles, 50, 100% larger than untrained people, but their fibers are the same size. And they have lots of type 1 fibers. So unless they started off
with just ridiculous
really itty bitty small fibers, and they spent decades training to make them average size, then something's probably going on there. And there's a study that Jose Antonio has written some nice work.
That's
on
what
this.
I've read. Yes.
Yeah, he's the man when it comes to he worked with a guy named Gagne in Texas who did like the weighted quail studies.
That's the one where they hang the weight
Yeah.
on their wing or whatever in a stretch position. And
Yep, it's kind of like the equivalent in a human would be, imagine literally a 200-pound guy and he takes like a 40-pound dumbbell, you strap it to his hand and he has to carry it around all day long and it's pulling on his trap. And so he's constantly you imagine that trap would grow. And the greatest increase in muscle size was in a study that they did, and they did a progressive overload weighted stretch and intermittently with these quail. So it was something like, I can't remember exact protocol, but they start off with maybe 20% of the animal's weight. So it'd be like a 40-pound dumbbell. And they had them put them under stretch for a couple of days, and they gave them a day off. So they wanted to actually have some recovery there. And then they bumped up the load to like 20 or 30%. And they gave a couple of days, gave them a day off. They did it for like a month. And the interesting thing is that over the course of that month, the muscle kept on getting larger, kept on growing. And the fibers kept on getting bigger for about the first 2/3 or so, or 3/4 of the study. So they had some animals they sacrificed early on, and some animals they let go the entire month. So they could kind of track what's going on with the whole muscle size, the muscle wet weight, and the fiber size. And in the last third or quarter of the study, the fibers actually started getting smaller. That's suggestive of
Hyperplasia.
Hyperplasia, yeah. And that's been known to happen. They can count the fibers. That model of muscle growth produces hyperplasia. There's no doubt about that.
Wow.
Yeah.
So because my belief would be that it just takes a long time. Like you got to train for a long time, high intensity for a long time.
Right.
That's where you start to get that. Because I notice as I get older, it's easy to keep muscle.
Yeah.
It wasn't when I was first building muscle, it was hard. Now, I mean, it's not hard for me to keep the muscle that I've built.
Right.
And this leads me to another question. With the sport of bodybuilding, of course, androgen use, anabolic steroid use, and it gets you to a certain size. Then you go off, you lose the muscle because now you're off. But if you stay on these anabolics for long enough and train long enough and increase the amount of satellite cells and potentially increase hyperplasia, could that produce permanent muscle growth? In other words, could people do cycles of anabolics and go off, but then be essentially better off than they were before in terms of muscle size or potential for muscle size?
So you can look at this different ways of knowing. You can look at some of the pros, like some of the best pros who've come off. You'll see pictures, like people love to post this on social media because they want it with the hashtag all drugs.
Yeah.
That sort of thing.
Yeah.
You'll see these pros who've shrunken back down. They've stopped training. They've stopped eating the way they used to. They just don't care.
They stopped everything.
Yeah, everything. They may have gotten depressed. And they don't retain size. They look very normal or even kind of small. Some of them have gotten sick too, so it's hard to know exactly. It's not a perfect experimental model. But there are some data in animals showing, of course, that satellite cells get turned on with anabolic steroids, and you get these epigenetic changes, which suggests that for any stimulus that you'd have, the muscle would be more responsive in a way that it wouldn't have been had it not been previously exposed to the anabolic steroids. So there's something there that gives you probably an advantage. So being like truly natural versus being clean. So previous steroid user who's now, back to just maybe a TRT or nothing, that clean person probably has an advantage in having had so much muscle mass previously, because hyperplasia could be one aspect of that. More satellite cells in those muscles so they can grow more easily, the epigenetic changes, all those sorts of things.
Oh, well, I mean, I know I have family members blue collar workers and they weren't anabolic steroid users, but people who swung hammers, or I have mail carriers, and they're retired. They're in their 70s now, but there's the muscles that they use so much, for 30, 40 years to work, still developed. I have an uncle who's 70-something years old, massive forearms.
Yes.
The dude doesn't do anything with his hands. He hasn't done anything with his hands for 20 years.
Right.
But the muscles haven't left his body because of that permanent, whatever you want to call it, muscle, hyperplasia or whatever.
Yeah, and some of that can be too is they've developed that pattern of use with the hand. So just in day to day, they have a lot of muscle mass available for doing things in the forearm, because they had to have that because of what they were doing occupationally or what have you. And then they go and they use that. They've developed sort of a neurological preference for using that muscle they once had, and that helps them hold on to that muscle mass in those places.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And it makes it, so here's another good question for you. Years, maybe 6 or 7 years ago now, I came up with a concept called trigger sessions. I didn't invent it, I don't think. I know other people have talked about similar things in the past, but for me it was new. And what I did with these was basically I did my normal workouts, so my normal intense weight training workouts. But then throughout the day, I would do these very light, low intensity kind of pumping sets with bands on particular body parts. Not super intense, wasn't getting sore, but just enough to give me a pump and to feel the muscle work. And the reason why I did this is I observed people who had muscular body parts who didn't work out but just used them all the time. Again, like the male carriers of my family. I had uncles and aunts who the rest of their body wasn't developed at all, but they had these really muscular calves, of course, body part that's supposed to be so difficult to develop, all because they walked so much as male carriers. So I said, I wonder if I did this kind of low level of very frequent stimulation on the rest of my body, what would happen? And it blew me the fuck away.
Yeah.
I grew and responded incredibly, and it blew me away because it was so low intensity. What do you think is happening with something like that?
So there is some, you like the research data, so I'll kind of give you research. Yeah. So there's some interesting parallels. If you look at how much muscle people will put on with resistance exercise, the rate of muscle gain is comparable to that which you see in like rats. They can actually do resistance exercise training in rats. They can put backpacks on them and have them train them to go up and down ladders, and the muscle will grow at a certain rate. They've actually done with cats. The Gagne person down in who Jose Antonio worked with in Texas, they trained the rats for a food reward to do like wrist flexion and like the flexor carpi ulnaris muscle, and they saw maybe some hyperplasia there. And you can also take rats, and I actually developed a model when I was in Texas in grad school where you can train the plantar flexion like a little calf press. And you see that the animals grow at about the same rate as humans do when you have them do resistance exercise. But then there's something else you can do with animals that you really can't do with people, but there's one study that I found which is kind of equivalent to it, is they'll do it's called a compensatory hypertrophy model. So in the calves in rats, you've got a soleus, a gastroc, and a plantaris. Plantaris is pretty big. Some humans have plantaris in both legs, or maybe just one. Not everyone does. It's sort of a variable thing. It's not a very big muscle in people. But they'll cut, like, for instance, the soleus and the plantaris in a rat. And then those animals, after a couple of days, will walk around normally. No training, no resistance exercise, no high intensity, just walking around. And you can increase that muscle by like 50%, 60% in a matter of a couple months. It's just compensating for the loss of muscle mass from the other muscles that have been clipped at the Achilles. So I did find a study, and it actually can get, I think I've seen about 100% increase in muscle size in the gastroc. Sometimes they'll cut the gastroc with the other muscles. There's various ways you can do it. There was a study where they had people who had torn their Achilles, and for whatever reason they couldn't repair it. So they take the flexor hallucis longus muscle, one that kind of lets you flex your big toe, and they would connect that at the calcaneus to take the place of the plantar flexors that normally would be there. And when they did a comparison of the normal leg versus the leg that had been surgically fixed, they got, the range was like 30 to 100% increase in size or difference in size.
And it's not intense work. It's just frequent.
Walking around.
Yeah, just
walking around. Yeah. So there's something to say for the extent to which muscle can grow if you just continuously load it throughout the day with normal activity. The thing is, you don't get that kind of muscle growth in the whole body, even like over a lifetime of training. People just don't increase their muscle mass by 100%. You can get 50%, pretty substantial. 70 extreme responders maybe better, but your nervous system just can't handle. You couldn't go in the gym and train for like 8 hours a day.
No, I wish.
It just wouldn't work. That's the limitation. Your nervous system would fail, your endocrine system would fail, your immune system would fail. You'd just be sick and tired and you'd be exhausted. Never happened.
Sure.
But the muscle can adapt to that. And that's the cool thing that you're doing with these trigger sessions, is that you're going in and just doing something that sort of simulated that chronic
mechanical
overload.
Signaling.
The mechanical stimulating, but only in a muscle or two, not the whole body.
Right.
It wasn't like squat all day long.
No. But if you did squat all day long, it would be you could do it with a very low intensity because you have to be careful for the CNS. And that's the thing that I noticed. And it really blew me away because when I first got into working out, I was under the impression you blast a muscle and then you leave it alone and let it rest and recover. So I used to that's what I used to do. I'd go to the gym, hammer my legs, and I'd sit on the couch and watch TV. And just, got to let them rest and recover.
Right.
And then I remember one summer I worked with my dad, who's a blue collar worker, and we were just working. I was mixing cement, carrying buckets and whatever. and my muscles grew.
Uh-huh.
I was like, what the hell's going on? I'm moving more and I'm building more muscle. And
Right.
and that's when I started kind of change my ideas around maybe what's going on. And I think if you adjust intensity, those frequent levels of stimulation make a big difference.
Now, along those lines of changing your way of thinking, when you get somebody, what are the most common things that you have to change in like a competitor? Like if I were to come to you and I'm like, okay, take me to the next level, Scott. What are there specific areas you typically look at that are common offenders in the average lifter that's lifting?
We actually kind of addressed this already. I will look at what they haven't done that may work for people. So I had one person come to me not too long ago who wanted me to train him in person, and his legs were his weakness. And I said, well, we're going to train. My system is a high frequency training system, and you train legs 3 times a week. You don't do 20 sets each workout. But I said, you'll go in, you'll do a heavy loading day, you'll do some what I call pump sets, and do a cluster set configuration that I call a muscle round, and you train legs 3 times a week. And he's like, well, no, you can't train legs 3 times a week. I'm like, no, it's not going to be like an hour and a half of legs 3 times a week. It's just maybe, you warm up and then you'll be done literally in like 10 minutes. On one of the days, that's it. And he wouldn't do it. He literally, he just would not go and do it. He couldn't wrap his mind around that. And I said, well, I'm not going to bring you into the gym and just push you through once weekly training sessions, even though that was something he probably could have benefited from, because he just didn't like to train legs. I want to optimize what's going to possibly work. So I'll look at the things the people haven't been doing. And that could be all sorts of things.
I would agree with you on that. I think for us, we talk on the show a lot. When I look at the common person that's lifting, I think frequency is probably one of the most underutilized tools out there. And we speculate that a lot of that has to do with the old, body part split mentality of just hammer the shit out of it one day a week.
Right.
And a lot of people would just greatly benefit by hitting that muscle group 2 or 3 times in the week consistently for a while, and they'll probably respond like crazy.
Yeah, and that's maybe those genetic differences in responders and non-responders when it comes to satellite cells can explain that. It's also, I think, psychologically, especially when it comes to legs, to know like you're going to go to the gym 5 times a week and 3 times of the week you're going to have to do squats or that people don't want to do that. You have to have some screws loose to want to go and train that way. But a lot of people do that with smaller muscle groups. Calves, for instance, I can go in and train calves every day. Yeah. John Meadows was here. He would train calves every day unless his feet hurt. That was sort of the rule of thumb. If his feet started to bother, he'd want to get plantar fasciitis, so he would not train calves. Or biceps, you could do that. But no one wants to do it with squats or leg presses or what have you.
Right.
So some of it's just the mentality. But there are those systems like milk and squats or super squats.
Wait, milk and squats. Hold on. Is this where you drink a gallon of milk a day?
Yes, this is the GOMAD. Yeah.
I've read about this. So this is where you literally drink a gallon of milk every day and squat every day.
Right. Yeah. I can't remember how. There's various variations on that. Yeah.
I put on 15 pounds. It's weird. Yeah. Well, yeah, you're drinking 2,000 calories of milk and you're squatting.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So excellent. Here's a good question for you. We've observed, and it's widely understood in common knowledge, although it's disputed, that free weights tend to build more muscle, especially in beginner and intermediate, than machines do. Is that true? And if it is, why would that be true? Like, why would a back squat build more muscle than a leg press, or a deadlift more than a machine row or something like that?
Could be a couple of different reasons. For instance, there's one study that I cite in my fortitude training book where they looked at muscle activation. I think it was in the biceps or the elbow flexors, and holding a weight that required a given amount of torque or a given amount of force versus pushing on a dynamometer, and holding the weight requires some balance. And because of that balance, you've got those accessory muscles that are involved, and this would go for any free weight versus a machine. You get greater activation in that muscle, so the EMG was actually higher. And one of the things that probably is involved with muscle growth, I could almost say without a doubt, is that, and we talked about this sort of indirectly, is novelty of stimulus. So if you go and do, you'll see this with the repeated bout effect. If you go and do an exercise you haven't done, this could be someone who's been training for years. Let's say you haven't done full deadlifts. You've been training all those muscles really as hard as you could, but you just haven't done full deads. And then you go in and you have a big dead day. You'd be sore as crap.
Oh, yeah.
It'll just whack you.
Absolutely.
But if you start doing deads every week or every other back day or what have you, you're not nearly as sore. One of the ways in which that might be occurring is a shift in your nervous system, learning how to activate those muscles with a little bit of a cleaner activation pattern. So those on and off rotation amongst motor units, turning on them at a certain frequency, which is best for producing a smooth tetanic contraction in those fibers. Those sorts of things you get better at. Whereas you can imagine if you had a nervous system that was just really shaky, and sometimes you'll see this, of course.
When you take time off the gym.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that shakiness is indicative of this nervous system not quite knowing how to activate as best as it possibly could. And that's the type of thing that's going to produce muscle soreness, because those fibers being turned on and off, the contractile lattice is sliding back and forth on itself,
causing damage.
Yeah, you're going to cause damage. So free weights in that sort of subtle way could potentially cause more muscle damage. Not that you want to damage the muscle per se, but if you look at like pure eccentric training versus pure concentric training, there's a meta-analysis where they looked at this. You get a little bit better growth from the eccentrics. You get more soreness from the eccentrics. You can still get growth from isometrics and concentrics. But there's something about the free weights in terms of maybe getting greater activation and potentially causing a little more damage, which initiates that whole remodeling response where you get more myofibrils, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, see, I'm in the same camp as you. That's what I think as well. But then it starts to break down when you go extreme balance. Like, oh, cool. So if balancing things then builds more muscle, then why don't I stand on a physio ball and hold one dumbbell up in the air? And that's just because the load isn't enough?
Well, then the activation goes down. They've done those studies too.
Oh, really? Okay.
Because then you've got such a balance task that you can't activate your mind-muscle connection's gone. You're trying to do like a dumbbell fly on a Swiss ball, and you're like rolling all over the place, and you can't lift the same load. You can't even come close. I mean, unless you want to like potentially burst the ball, then you've got another problem. But someone who could use 100-pound dumbbells is, if they've got a really difficult balance task, is not going to be able to use 100-pound dumbbells. And that's going to tell you to some degree they're not going to activate the pecs in the same way.
Interesting.
The other thing with free weights that psychology is such a big deal. Exercise physiologists sometimes will just say the brain's just a big black box. We don't really worry about it. But if you think about the people who are, and the mentality that comes with free weights, just think about your average guy who goes in the gym, who's thinking about what do you bench? And he's comparing himself. Everyone knows what's on the bar with free weights. People don't know what's on the machine when you put the pin in there. There's no comparison. So if you got 135, you see the young kids who go in there, they've got 135 on the bar. They don't want to do 95 because they know that makes them look like a wimpy. They want to do heavier loads. So free weights, I think, just from a sort of a psychosocial perspective, lend themselves better to training harder. And the people that have the mentality, like Jordan Peters, for instance, they want to move the biggest loads they possibly can. And the people that want to get the most muscle growth often realize that the harder way there is often going to be the most productive. It's not always the case. The counterpoint to that is that sometimes, and I did this with squats for years. Squats never did much for my legs. I got it to doing a 585-pound squats for reps. I just got a big glutes. I didn't get the leg growth I wanted. Just the biomechanics and everything I possibly could.
You're just glute dominant.
And I was just really, really glute dominant. My low back. Actually, I got good back growth from it.
Every bikini model's dream.
Right, exactly. So you can get a bit of mind muscle connection if you find a nice loading curve or good biomechanics in a machine. Some machines just feel phenomenal. It's like this chest press, this particular converging chest press with this cam on it just has a phenomenal loading curve. I don't feel like I'm using my triceps or my anterior delts at all. It's just brilliant. That's going to be a great machine if you progressively overload on it. Whereas for some people, every time I warm up on the bench press and I feel my rotator cuff, just both sides just wanted to like rip in half. Probably not a good exercise.
Yeah. And the other thing about free weights too is when you use a machine, you have to move based on the way the machine moves, whereas free weights follows the person. So whether you're 5'5" or 6 foot, the bar follows you versus the other way around.
Right.
What about advanced training techniques? Things that we wouldn't necessarily recommend to the average person, but things you might utilize in advanced training. For example, forced reps or partial reps or weighted stretches in between sets or, those types of things. Like, where do you see lots of value in those, and which ones do you use?
Is there a hierarchy of those?
Yes. gosh, there's so many bits and pieces there. All those intensification techniques have to be used very carefully, because the way I look at things is that the limitation is your nervous system to some degree. The muscle can handle all sorts of things that the nervous system can't, like we talked about with the comparing animal muscle growth with humans, resistance training versus those special compensatory hypertrophy types of things. I like to use, you didn't mention this one, but cluster sets. I have a muscle, this is what DC training, dog crab training is, rest pause sets. In those rest pause sets, actually, each of the segments of a rest pause set would be taken to failure. I like to use a muscle round. I modified this. I took this from the name from something called Titan training that was very instrumental in me developing fortitude training as it now is. And it's a way to bring yourself closer to failure and accumulating those high quality 1 or 2 reps in reserve contractions with only one failure point. So in the case of a muscle round, you're doing sets of 4 on about a 1-to-1 work to rest ratio with a load that would for most people be about a 15 rep max if you just did a normal straight set.
So give me an example. Give me an example of an exercise and what that would look like.
Let's take a biceps curl.
Okay.
So let's say you could do 100 pounds for 15 reps.
Okay.
If you just did a normal straight set with nice control. So in this case, you take that 100 pounds and you do a set of 4, and you could either watch your watch or you could take 5 breaths. So you do a set of 4, 5 breaths, set of 4, 5 breaths, a set of 4, 5 breaths, a set of 4, 5 breaths, and maybe in that 5th or 6th set, you would reach a failure point. So let's say you go 5 sets of 4, and then you get into the 6th set and you fail at your 2nd rep. So you've now completed 22 reps
of something that you could normally only do 15 with.
Right, and you only had one failure point. And the way I've said,
I see.
Yeah, so
it's 5 breaths or 5 seconds,
or 10 seconds,
about 10 seconds in between.
Usually that's it. If you're training legs, counting your breaths is a no-go because you're just going to be breathing like a locomotive. You don't even want to do that, so you have to watch your watch.
So you do 4 reps, take 10 seconds, 4 reps, 10 seconds. Is it always 4 reps?
That's the way. Yeah, that's how he had it in Titan training.
Okay.
There's nothing particularly magic about the 4 reps per se. It just seems to work out nicely. I played with different numbers.
Okay.
There's another system called Myo Reps, and Dante Trudell's system. He's a little bit different because he takes each of those segments to failure.
So he goes failure, rest, failure, rest.
Will you run a full cluster workout like that where you are doing every muscle group like that, or what would a workout look like with that cluster set in there?
Yeah, so I have different days. I utilize a daily undulating periodization scheme. So one day, let's say for legs, you would do what I call loading sets. These are like 6 to 12 rep range. The next day you train legs, you do pump sets, and these are fun. They're brutal, but they're fun. It's anything like about a 15 to 20 to a 30 rep range. Yeah. But you do all sorts of partials. There are various ways. You could do reverse 21s.
Right, we're just chasing the pump on that day.
Yeah, but it's metabolic stress, and it ends up giving you a great pump. And then the next time you train legs, you would do muscle rounds. And I've got the system I've set up is I have 3 different volume tiers. So depending on how someone recovers, they would pick the volume tier that they're going to use for that day. So someone who just can handle a ton of volume, or that maybe they've decided to set up a mesocycle where they're going to go up in their volume and come back down in their volume because they like that, or they're just completely auto-regulating. They go into that particular week, I feel great. I got a week off of work. There's no stress at home. I'm sleeping. I'm eating great. They might do the higher volume tier, and they might do like two sets of like a leg press and a Smith squat for a muscle round each, and then maybe like a knee extension and then a hamstring curl of some sort. That's it.
So you're really only doing, you got the 2 cluster sets you just said, and then maybe one other one after that, and then
on that volume. But you've also done more. That's also the 3rd time you train legs that week.
Right.
So you're doing it once a week. That the cluster sets are once a week, but having trained legs traditionally or more traditionally the other times a week.
There's a heavy day and a light day, and then the muscle round day.
Right.
So the muscle rounds, the idea there is to accumulate training volume and make use of the fact the muscle can adapt much more readily than the nervous system and the other systems by getting 22 reps as opposed to just 15. So you get 22 reps of loading on that muscle for a given muscle round in that example, as opposed to 15, but only one failure point.
Wow. Now, when you apply this to athletes, do they see crazy results from just applying these cluster sets?
I have people do the whole system. Everything's kind of integrated. So, yeah, I've seen. My favorite example was a guy. He was a math teacher from the UK, as a mathematician, and so he taught calculus to gifted students. He was very mathematically inclined, logged everything, and he also could eat like none other. I used the nutrient timing approach, and so he was like pushing down 1,000 grams of carbs during his post-workout period some nights. But he was okay with that because on training days he was a little bit hungry given how I had timed the nutrients. And he went through one blast, which would typically take about maybe 6 weeks. You do a deload, a cruise is what Dante Trudell called it. I've got a way of doing that based on the research too. And he came back in and he looked at his logbook to see what weights he was going to use. And he picked, the first day was loading set day, and he picked the weight that he figured, I think he was getting like 8 or 9 reps with, so he figured he'd just stick with that because he hadn't gotten to the top of the 12 rep range. And he did like his set, and he got like 24 reps. And he's like, he was pissed because he's like, I'm a mathematics teacher. I can't count weight. What did I do wrong? Yeah. And he kept on doing like that. He had really deloaded so well that he was like almost doubling his reps. Wow. He just timed it really, really well. He was really quite upset. He went through a couple workouts like that and finally figured out that was happening universally. And that was because some of that was just because of the novelty of training. There's various things that I think are going on there. One, he was getting used to training hard with those heavier loads in maybe a way that he hadn't. Also, when you do the high rep, the pump sets can be some of the most brutal aspects of the training.
Yeah, you don't need to convince me.
Yeah, they're they're really, really hard. So like you do a set like that where it's like you're saying hello to God at the end of the set, and then when you just do a set of 12, it's heavy. Well, it's not nearly as hard. So you develop sort of a different mentality that allows you to push harder in those loading sets in a way you didn't. So those things, I think they interact in a certain way. Then the thing about the cluster sets as well, the muscle rounds, is probably that you get to really realize what failure is for you. If they've done studies with untrained people and have them try to estimate how many reps they can get with a given load, and they're way off. They'll underestimate.
I even find that with myself. I don't train to failure very often at all, and when I do, I'm always shocked that I'm like, this is the next rep. This is the only one I'm going to be able. This is the last one. I'm like, no, I think I can do another one.
Yeah.
It turns out to be 5 more reps.
Right.
Because your gauge for how much you can do, you have to test it every once in a while. Otherwise, you have no idea. You kind of have no idea, or at least your idea is way off. You talk a lot about balancing the central nervous system with the muscular system in terms of intensity and volume, and muscles can take a lot. The CNS is the one that you got to kind of watch a little bit. What are some techniques that you use for your athletes on allowing their CNS to be able to take more? Because theoretically they could just work out their muscles all the time, but you got to get them to manage their CNS. Do you use techniques like sauna, cold, rinses, sleep? Are there supplements that you use to help them out?
Sauna can be phenomenal. Yeah, absolutely. I'm rebuilding my house now, and I want to get a sauna in there. If I can squeeze it in, I can get my contractor to kind of do what I'm hoping he'll do. Just for clearing all the chemicals that are in our environment. I know you guys have talked about everything from xenoestrogens and things in our water supply. Tampa has horrible water.
Oh, yeah.
So that can be phenomenal. People get a nice anxiolytic effect. I'm really big on sleep aids. We sleep horribly in our society. It's really, really badly. So I will sometimes dip into Chinese medicine and try to help people with sleep in that regard.
Are there some good herbs that you typically will recommend?
Kind of depends on the person and what's going on. There's different reasons why someone might. There's probably about 8 different diagnoses that would just sound like gobbledygook if I told you what they are. But one is Ziziphus.
Okay. Is
Swansao Ren is the name of the herb, and you can buy that. It's one of those ones. It does have kind of a sedative-like effect for many people. I had a client come in once who, if I recall, she was a young woman. She had a sugar daddy, and she didn't have anything to do with her life. And she would just stay up and play video games, and she came in, and she wasn't sleeping like at all. And we gave her this herbal formula. She came back the next week for her next visit, and was like, "How's your sleep going?" She's like, "I'm sleeping all the time." It's like, "Oh, that's awesome. How much sleep are you getting at night?" She's like, 20, 22 hours.
Whoa.
Like, no, hold on. Like, what do you mean? It's like, no, I sleep all the time. I just take the herbs and I sleep all day long. I don't even play video games. It's like, well, she could do that because she had nothing to do.
Yeah.
So that was too much. That was a little excessive. But that's a great one for many people. And it's one of those ones. Normally in Chinese medicine, you do a diagnosis, if you do a pattern differentiation, and then you apply that paradigm of Chinese medicine very specifically to the person. That's one that helps a lot of people. So,
what about ashwagandha? I know that's considered an adaptogenic herb. I've used it myself. I really like combining it with caffeine, one of my favorite combinations. How does that affect the CNS, or is that one of those supplements that can help that?
Yeah, that's a phenomenal adaptogen.
Okay.
It's been used in Ayurvedic medicine for years and years and years. Yeah, and I actually use that myself.
Oh, do you? Okay.
Yeah, and I suggest that to people.
How do you use it?
Just in the mornings. It seems to have kind of a nootropic effect.
Okay.
It doesn't impact sleep in me, but sometimes people will notice that too. For instance, ginseng is one in Chinese medicine. You have to be careful. Some of those will impact sleep.
I can't do ginseng. I saw an I used to go to an acupuncturist for a while, and she did the test on me, and she's like, "Oh, you have too much yang energy or whatever." And so red ginseng was wrong for me because. Right. And I told her this. I've taken ginseng in the past, and if I take it once, I'll feel stimulated. If I take it again, I start to feel feverish, and I almost start to feel kind of depressed and like I have the flu almost. And she said it's because it's strengthening your yang, which is already you have too much.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So she was telling the truth.
Yeah. That's that. Yeah. Definitely, you can give people insomnia with that. It's a lung qi tonic in Chinese medicine. So some people have undergone a lot of sadness. When sadness impacts the lung and the lung energy. So people they're
the sigh.
Really sad, yeah. So you want to give them that, but then they can't sleep. That doesn't help. So that was a mistake. That was like a beginner's mistake we'd always make. And it's like, no, you're going to just give them insomnia. That's not good. Find another way around that. Yeah.
So you're the perfect person to ask this. I did some experiments a few months ago, and I've replicated a few times just on myself. And I was really blown away by how my body responded. So what I did was I had a whole day where I had nothing to do other than write content for our business. So I was going to be home all day long, and I have a home garage. And so what I did was I picked 3 exercises, and I did not really heavy load, but heavy enough to feel. And I did 3 sets of 5 reps of each of those exercises every other hour. All day long. So I must have done about 7 workouts. Okay. And I theorized that I would start to feel stronger as the day progressed, and then I would start to feel weaker as the day progressed. And that's exactly what happened. I got stronger by the 3rd or 4th workout. Doing that, I noticeably built muscle. And each time I've done that, those all-day workouts, it's not failure. I'm not going to failure. It's not super intense. Right. But if you add up the total volume, I'm doing an incredible amount of volume in sets. Have you ever experimented with like all-day workoup like that, or what do you think may be happening there?
It's this chronic overload thing we've talked about.
It's almost like an extended version of your cluster set.
Yeah, I guess you could say. Nah, not really. Quite, but yeah, but it's just like the mechanic who's constantly doing the work, or when you started working with your dad, your legs grew. It's probably like late afternoon is when you felt the strongest. Yes. Yeah, that's what the research generally suggests. Performance is enhanced at that time point.
Yeah, it was really weird, Yeah. And I could feel myself almost building muscle doing this, and you add up the total volume, and it was just, I don't remember how many total sets I did, but it was insane.
Oh, I can absolutely believe it. It's funny. I did a charity event this last weekend with Paul Carter. He writes for T Nation, phenomenal guy. Paul, how's it going, brother? And we talked about. One of the questions that was asked was a woman who was working out with another woman who wanted to gain weight, very unusual. She wanted to lose weight. How should our workouts differ? And it points back to this idea that we've created the workout as like this 1 hour period of time where you do everything you're going to do to try to get muscle growth, and we ignore the idea that you're pointing at there is that literally throughout the day, if you had a life and a lifestyle that would allow you to do that, you could train that way. It's not something like you're an unusual person, I think, in this regard, and that you want to experiment. Oh yeah, this is your curiosity is almost limitless. Right, I'm guessing. So you're willing to do that. Plus, you don't mind the pain and misery of picking things up repeatedly.
I'm staying at home and working out all day. Nobody wants to do that.
Right, exactly. People don't. Most people don't want to go to the gym. That's why exercise adherence is so poor. But yeah, that's a perfectly viable way. Again, we're just trying to get the callus to develop in terms of the muscle size. I think of it, there's so many analogies, but I think of it, if you wanted to get a good suntan, Would you go to the tanning booth and like just blast yourself for an hour? And you just get burnt.
No.
You go out in the sun every day.
Yeah. I use that exact, by the way, I use that exact analogy probably like 10 times.
Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah, it's a perfect analogy.
It is. It's all adaptation systems.
Yeah.
You know?
Repeated exposure. Like that's sending the signals like, hey, by the way, we need browner skin. We need browner skin. We need bigger muscles. We need bigger muscles again and again. If the system gets it like once a week, so there's so many ways that muscle can adapt and the nervous system can adapt for that infrequent type of challenge. The nervous system can just sort of figure out, how to activate the muscle better. You can just increase enzymatic capacity to improve fatigue. It's just not enough, in my mind, to it seems like at least to warrant for most people really much of an adaptive response because it's so infrequent.
I agree. It's interesting when you examine all the different training methodologies, how they can be almost at odds. Like you had, like Mike Menser in heavy duty style training where you're hitting a body part once, absolute failure, leave it alone.
Right.
Arnold doing 20 sets per body part 3 days a week, high volume, high pump. You still have bodybuilders on those two extremes, but I think rather than highlighting which one is the ideal, I think it's more just highlighting the difference in genetic variances would be my opinion.
Yeah. Well, like as I said before, there are people that can do well with the once a week thing. Some of that probably there's at some point in time you're starting just to accumulate junk volume. Mm-hmm. So the recovery ability is gigantic. One of the things that kind of comes out when you, if you talk to, there's a number of different things. We talk to high level pro bodybuilders, is they know, like I trained with Dave Henry. I've coached Dave for years. Every time Dave would do a new exercise, I could always just tell from his biomechanics that he could activate the muscle in a really, really good way. And he's very, very strong. So he didn't have any ego that made him want to like do sloppy reps to move weight around. He also was really hardy, just could recover for things really, really well. And I've run into this again and again and again. If you talk to high-level bodybuilders, pros, a lot of them are very, very relaxed people. They go in the gym and they can push themselves really, really hard, but they're not stressed. They're just chilling out most of the time. They're not like frantic running around like, oh my gosh. You will run into bodybuilders sometimes who are just the body dysmorphia is off the charts. They're constantly looking at themselves in the mirror. They're freaking out. Those are the ones a lot of times too, in order to get where they've gotten, have gone to absolute extremes and drug use and various other things. They're not the best. So Ronnie Coleman, I think it's the unbelievable.
He was a cop for years while he was doing professional bodybuilding.
Right. And when you see like in the one of the videos, he just goes in, he's just totally relaxed, like nothing's bothering him. He had one of my favorite, I can't remember what it was he was saying. He's driving along in his car and he's trying to, the car's supposed to recognize what he's saying. Like he's dialing a number with the talk to text. And he has to say it like 5 times. In his thick Texas accent, 5, 7, 1, 4, 3, and he gets it wrong every time. It doesn't bother him. He's not stressed by it one bit. Yeah. Jay Cutler's just as nice and relaxed as they get.
Ben Pekulski's a good example. You sit with that guy, and he's like a yogi floating off the couch.
I was just down at Ben's place a few days ago. He's in Tampa too. Yeah, he's great. Dexter Jackson, just laid back, chill. Sean Roden. Like you go down the list, a lot of those guys are really, so that behooves really good recovery. There's other things that are involved.
Yeah, we don't talk enough about the stuff you don't do or the stuff that you do when you're not training and not eating that impact muscle growth.
Yeah,
and I think that makes what you're saying makes a huge difference. Right. Absolutely. I know when I went through some of the most difficult, stressful times of my life, for sure my body was not responding to exercise, I never stop working out.
Right. You can drop muscle really, really quickly when things have gone awry in your life.
So I have a question for you. Let's say you have somebody who's been working out for years, and then they go on their first anabolic steroid cycle. Should they change their training? And if they do change their training, what would they change? What should they do?
Well, my big thing is always get the most from the least. So the idea would be that they don't all of a sudden go into some monstrous cycle that requires them to change a whole bunch of things. I'm big on auto-regulating. That's how Fortitude training is set up. So
listen to your body, basically.
Listen to your body, choose the volume tier, choose the exercises that work for you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And when I just diet, it's based on the progress the person is making at the time, whether they're trying to gain muscle or lose fat. So if, for instance, that person goes on a moderate cycle, which would make sense. Because if you play all your trump cards as far as the chemistry goes, chances are this is just sort of theoretical, but you would lose that sensitivity in the future if someone just goes to like a 2 gram per week cycle.
Sure.
You can only gain muscle so fast. Some people will just grow like weeds, and it won't really matter, it seems like, in the long run. But you want to get as much as you possibly can from that initial slight stimulus. And so do all the things you possibly can to increase food, to match that. If you can handle more training, then do so. But the other thing to recognize is that now if you are stronger and you do have somewhat of a toxic load coming from those drugs, you might just keep the volume the same. Because now you're lifting heavier loads. And Dorian Yates is the kind of the quintessential example of this, where he found that he had to train with lower volume over time, over the years, the stronger he got. Because
it's more damage on his body, just the weight alone.
Yeah, just everything. And we've talked about it's been kind of a hot topic. You probably talked about Brad Schoenfeld's volume study that.
No, let's bring that up though.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So it came out in this past year, and they found a dose response for training volume in terms of muscle growth, not for strength, ironically enough, which is kind of a standout situation because that's not typically what you'd find. But they had in their highest volume group, they were training for the lower body. I think it was 45 sets per week to failure. In like the 8 to 12 rep range. Something like that. So that was like those workouts where like they were going in and doing like 5 sets of squat to failure, 8 to 12 rep range, and then 90 seconds between sets, and then 2 minutes rest. They go to 5. They'd start doing 90 seconds rest between sets of 8 to 12 on a leg press. It was, if you read through the methods, which a lot of people don't do, they just read the abstract. Think, oh, okay, the more better. I can do this many sets. It was diabolical. It would have just been. I would have had rhabdomyolysis and been hospitalized myself trying to do that, because I would have been doing just crazy loads. It just can't happen. Now there's got to be those were people who were resistance trained, but there had to have been a good number of reps in reserve really for them to have accomplished that. So. Though that kind of volume is not something you can handle when you already become pretty strong or you're getting stronger. The main thing is that the stimulus needs to be balanced by recovery. So if anything, if you want, in my opinion, if someone gets on and they start making better gains and their gains are coming at a reasonable rate, just allow the recovery to help with that. Don't bite that urge to like, okay, now I'm Superman.
Now I got to turbocharge everything.
And now I can just go bonkers. Yeah, it may not be the case. You don't know.
And with anabolics, you talked about how people stop responding because they've just been on them for too long. Is that receptor downregulation that's happening?
Yeah, so the literature there, the receptors don't seem to downregulate.
Okay.
In terms of the receptor density, they may even go up, but there's some desensitization that's obviously happening there. There also seems to be, like if you look at like that the study by Jose Antonio we talked about, and if you look at other studies looking at highly hypertrophied muscle cells, there's some limit to how big the muscle cells can get too. So there's probably something in the muscle cell such that as it's growing and growing and growing, it's just gonna slow down that rate of growth. It can only become so large so quickly. So I don't know what's going on exactly in terms of the molecular mechanisms that would cause the desensitization, but it's like, gosh, because I've been online since literally the beginning of the internet, and people will always say, well, the receptor density doesn't go down. It's like, well, if there's no desensitization, this would be a really phenomenal lack of biological negative feedback. It's like, well, you could just keep taking drugs and you would just, grow the size of the Michelin Man. Yeah, right. Yeah. There'd be no limit. Everyone would look like Big Ramy and then bigger. Yep. There has to be some limiting negative feedback, putting things in to a stop or bringing things to a standstill. I don't know what it is though.
Yeah, interesting. Interesting. Well, shit, man, fascinating and fun interview.
Yeah,
you are full of information. Yeah. I could talk to you for another 2 or 3 hours.
I get this. The questions aren't slowing down at all.
No, not at all. No, I really appreciate you coming on the show, man, and answering some of these questions. Definitely. I mean, I think a lot of our audience that's interested in the intricacies of muscle building and training, and especially the advanced techniques and stuff that you're talking about, I think is really going to help them out.
Cool.
So I appreciate you coming on, man.
That's part of my mission. To help as much as possible.
Thank you very much, man.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to Mind Pump. If your goal is to build and shape your body, dramatically improve your health and energy, and maximize your overall performance, check out our discounted RGB Super Bundle at mindpumpmedia.com. The RGB Super Bundle includes MAPS Anabolic, MAPS Performance, and MAPS Aesthetic. 9 months of phased expert exercise programming designed by Sal, Adam, and Justin to systematically transform the way your body looks, feels, and performs. With detailed workout blueprints and over 200 videos, the RGB Super Bundle is like having Sal, Adam, and Justin as your own personal trainers, but at a fraction of the price. The RGB Super Bundle has a full 30-day money-back guarantee, and you can get it now plus other valuable free resources at mindpumpmedia.com. If you enjoy this show, please share the love by leaving us a 5-star rating and review on iTunes and by introducing Mind Pump to your friends and family. We thank you for your support, and until next time, this is Mind Pump.